The primary aim of this module is to describe and explain the use of the computerized flight plan produced by the Operations Department. The standard fuel policy will be explained by analyzing the fuel load for a typical flight.
Additional procedures for exceptional circumstances will also be illustrated. An alternative method for calculating trip and diversion fuel will be demonstrated using the trip fuel and time data table in the AOM. Finally, typical speed profiles for climb, cruise and descent will be stated.
We shall begin our description of flight planning procedures by looking at the computerized flight plan. The flight plan is produced by the Operations Department. For this example, the Gatwick to Düsseldorf route will be used. The route number, aircraft tail number, and estimated departure time are shown at the top of the plan. Check for accuracy.
The next row shows the average wind component for the whole route, in this case -2 knots. Also indicated is the initial flight level with the outside air temperature and the weather prognosis being used. This is a 6-figure date and time group. Forecasts are based on observations made at midnight and midday GMT. The weather data is then fed into the computer twice daily around 0600 and 1800 hours.
The flight plan has a section devoted to fuel planning. The fuel loads shown and the relative quantities in each are representative of the standard fuel policy.
Trip fuel covers fuel consumed from brakes release to touchdown. As a gross error check, an average trip fuel burn of 32 to 34 kilos per minute may be expected with a full payload.
Contingency fuel covers en route situations such as errors in forecast winds or temperature, navigation errors, and ATC restrictions on altitude or route. It is calculated as either 15 minutes holding at 1,500 feet or 5% of the trip fuel, whichever is greater. Note that Fokker 100 plans normally show 15 minutes holding at maximum landing weight.
Also note the methods of calculating contingency fuel for exceptional circumstances. Diversion fuel is based upon the distance and flight time to the alternate airfield, in this case Frankfurt. It includes a 5% contingency allowance. Also shown is the safety altitude of 4,500 feet and average wind component of +9 knots. The planning fuel alternate should not be less than 100 nautical miles from the destination unless the weather at a closer alternate is twice the normal minima. Reserve fuel is calculated as 30 minutes holding allowance at 1,500 feet at the maximum landing weight. When necessary, the captain can refine the holding fuel by basing it on the planned landing weight. By adding the trip, contingency, diversion and reserve fuel together, a total for the minimum takeoff fuel is produced. A standard allowance of 150 kilos provides 10 minutes of taxiing time. If additional taxi time is anticipated, add 15 kilos for each extra minute. If the crew chooses to carry extra fuel for reasons such as tankering or congestion, then this must be entered on the flight plan. Both the taxi and any extra fuel required is added to the minimum takeoff fuel to produce a minimum ramp fuel requirement. If a tankering plan is used, a max tank line appears on the flight plan. This sets an upper limit for the amount of additional fuel that may be carried. For this example, a value of 8,800 kilos is appropriate. Should tankering be used, trip fuel would be increased, thus adding to the takeoff and landing weights. A burn correction also appears on the flight plan. This indicates a burn reduction should full advantage not be taken of the tankering capability.
The standard minimum reserve comprises diversion fuel and reserve fuel. CMR must be on board the aircraft at destination. Note that the 1,300 kilo minimum figure for CMR is only a pre-flight consideration.
CMR requirements may be modified as shown. Note that the minimum diversion fuel comprises the diversion fuel plus 500 kilos. This is the absolute minimum fuel at which a pilot must initiate diversion, but never plan to let the fuel state fall this low. Also shown in this section is the zero fuel weight on which the fuel calculations are based, with the resulting takeoff and landing weights. The zero fuel weight for this example is representative of a 6,000 kilogram payload. Loading will be discussed in greater detail in Module 23, Performance, Load and Balance. Listed below the fuel weights are up to 3 additional alternate airports for this flight, in this case Brussels, Luxembourg and Cologne. Please note that for each alternate destination, the diversion fuel load, flight time, distance in nautical miles, safety altitude, and average wind component are given. Below the alternate destinations are sections for general flight and crew data to be filled in by the pilot, flight level information showing flight times and fuel burn for different flight levels, and a list of the en route waypoints and their geographic positions. The second section of the flight plan provides detailed en route information. The left-hand column shows the particular airway route to be used for that section of the flight. Also shown is the minimum safety altitude in thousands of feet. The figure shown gives at least 1,000 feet clearance above terrain and notified obstacles within 30 nautical miles of the track. No MSA value is given for departure or arrival because the crew would be referring to airport charts. Airway waypoints are given. The associated data displayed on each line refers to flying into that waypoint from the one previously listed. The beacon frequency is also provided where applicable. The D suffix indicates a VOR with DME equipment. An average magnetic track is given into the waypoint shown. Zone distance indicates the distance in nautical miles from the previous waypoint to the waypoint specified on that line of the plan. The wind velocity and direction in each of the zones is also indicated, as is the ground speed in knots, and the flight time in minutes in each zone between the waypoints. The estimated time of arrival at each waypoint may be calculated by adding each consecutive zone time to the airborne time. If the ETA is different to the estimated one, indicate the revised time in minutes early or late beside the ETA figures. Also provided is a column for noting the actual time of arrival at each waypoint. A value is provided to show the distance from each waypoint to the final destination. This figure is in nautical miles. The fuel burn from that waypoint to touchdown at the destination is also given in hundreds of kilograms. Please note that no reserves are included. Finally, the tanks column allows the actual fuel in the tanks at the specified points to be recorded. The figures shown should be at least the fuel burn to touchdown plus the company minimum reserve to enable the flight to continue. To illustrate the use of the fuel required and tanks column, consider coxswain to touchdown as an example. A fuel burn of 900 kilos is required. The company minimum reserve for this example is 2,143 kilos. Hence, at coxswain, the tanks should show a value of at least 3,043 kilos. If the fuel on board at Coxie is actually 3,500 kilos, then the crew have roughly 450 kilos in hand. The minimum diversion fuel would be the sum of the diversion fuel for the flight plus 500 kilos. However, never plan to let your fuel state fall this low before you initiate a diversion. Consult your paper-based training materials for additional practice in the use of the computerized flight plans. An alternate method for calculating trip and diversion fuel uses the trip fuel and time data table in the AOM. This can also be used as a gross error check for values given on the computer flight plan. Given values for landing weight, trip distance, and wind component, the trip time and trip fuel can be calculated. Landing weight can be approximated by adding the estimated payload to the empty aircraft weight. A further 2,500 kilos should be added to account for fuel reserves. First, choose a representative value for the true airspeed from the trip fuel and time data table. For a distance of 750 nautical miles against a headwind, a value of 370 knots would be reasonable. The next step is to calculate the air distance using the formula shown. Air distance is the actual distance combined with an allowance for head or tail winds. For the parameters given in this example, an air distance of 804 nautical miles results. Refer once again to the trip fuel and time data table and interpolate values for an air distance of 804 nautical miles. This produces a trip fuel of 4,210 kilos and would take 2 hours 10 minutes. Diversion fuel can also be calculated using this table, but it must be remembered that a 5% contingency allowance has to be added. In concluding this section on flight planning, we shall briefly look at advisory speed profiles for climb, cruise, and descent. For the flight management system, insert the cost index and fly econ mode for climb, cruise, and descent. Hold at the FMS calculated holding speed. The manufacturer provides recommended values. For minimum fuel burn, use the FMS minimum fuel profile or target the speed shown.
Indicated is the advisory value for the flight through turbulence. Finally, the standard values for climb, cruise, and descent are shown. In this module, the computerized flight plan produced by the Operations Department was explained in detail. With reference to the standard fuel policy, we noted that the fuel load for each flight consists of trip fuel, which may be roughly estimated at 32 to 34 kilos fuel burn per minute.
Contingency fuel, which is either 5% of trip fuel or 15 minutes holding at 1,500 feet. Diversion fuel, which has a 5% contingency allowance already included, and a reserve allowance, which is equal to 30 minutes holding at 1,500 feet at maximum landing weight. The minimum takeoff fuel is therefore the product of trip, contingency, diversion, and reserve fuel added together. Those procedures which are applicable in exceptional situations were also illustrated.
It was stated that the standard minimum reserve comprises of the diversion and reserve fuel. The CMR must be on board the aircraft on arrival at the destination. The en route situation and resulting procedures which can modify the flight plan standard minimum reserve were indicated.
It was stated that minimum diversion fuel, which is the absolute minimum fuel remaining at which a captain must initiate diversion, is equal to diversion fuel plus 500 kilos. The data on waypoints and their associated zones was described. It was stated that each horizontal line contains information relating to flying towards the specified waypoint from the waypoint in the line above. A method was demonstrated for calculating trip and diversion fuel using the trip fuel and time data table. Finally, we looked at various recommended profiles for climb, cruise and descent.